For coming back. I'm actually going to make two introductions now. First, I'm going to introduce the person who prepared this presentation, and then I'm going to introduce the person who is giving the presentation. Unfortunately, Dr. Margaret Bentley was unable to join us, but she did prepare her presentation, and that's what Dr. Usha Ramakrishnan is going to do this morning. But let's first meet Dr. Margaret Bentley. She's the Distinguished Professor of Global Nutrition and Associate Dean for Global Health at the University of North Carolina. She's received several major awards for her achievements in excellence in research, teaching, and service, including the American Society of Nutrition Kellogg International Nutrition Award. Her research focuses on women and infants' nutrition, infant and young child feeding, behavioral research on HIV and nutrition, and community-based interventions for nutrition and health. She's been involved in WASH-related interventions, including integrated interventions for health and for nutrition and hygiene. She's worked both globally and locally on infant and young child feeding research. She uses diverse methodology, including ethnographic, qualitative, and mixed methods research, and she's led several major research studies funded by the National Institutes of Health and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, including a funded intervention to improve child growth and development in Andhra Pradesh, India. So I will now introduce our speaker. Dr. Usha Ramakrishnan is Professor and Vice Chair of the Herbert Department of Global Health at the Rollins School of Public Health and Director of the Doctoral Program in Nutrition and Health Sciences in the Graduate Institute at Emory University. Dr. Ramakrishnan is a leading expert in maternal and child nutrition and has authored 150 research papers in peer-reviewed journals and many book chapters. She's designed and led large randomized controlled trials that evaluate the benefits of nutrient interventions during pregnancy and early childhood on birth outcomes and child growth and development. She's participated in many working groups and global consultations and chaired several symposiums at various workshops. She's a member of the NIH NICHD study section on obstetrics and maternal fetal biology, and a member of the Global Nutrition Council of the American Society of Nutrition. Her current interests include a large RCT evaluating the benefits of preconceptual micronutrient supplements in pregnant women in Vietnam and the follow-up of their offspring. She also works on the effects of prenatal omega-3 fatty acids on child growth and development. So welcome, Usha, and I will not introduce you again after lunch, just so that everyone knows we will see her again after lunch. Welcome.
Thank you. Namaskar. I'm really honored to be back here. As I mentioned to folks, I spent some of my preschool years in Calcutta, and right now I'm filling very big shoes. It's really unfortunate Dr. Bentley would have loved to have been here. So I have her notes, and I will try to do justice to what she would like to communicate to all of you. The presentation really focuses on what, when, and most importantly, how young children are fed. And she has worked in India, and some of her slides actually draw from the work that she's done with colleagues in India. I think Dr. Neufeld already showed you the burden of malnutrition globally in young children, while we still have the unfinished agenda of undernutrition, be it manifested as stunting, wasting, micronutrient deficiency. We are well into the other form of malnutrition, because mal is imbalance or bad, which is overweight and obesity. That is also affecting young children. And this is a real challenge, as we are all experiencing globally this transition in terms of what we consume, where we get our food from, our activity patterns. The kids seem to be born with the iPhone in their hand these days. So all the technological changes as well. The focus of our presentation is really on young children. What are the recommendations? What do we know? And so quite a bit of work has been done. Some of you may be familiar with this. These are the global recommendations for infant and young child feeding. They serve as guidelines. They are intended for populations. Many of you here are pediatricians. You're practicing with individual children. But having these guidelines are extremely important as one says, what are the norms? And you see ones by WHO and UNICEF here that focus both on breastfeeding and the transition to complementary feeding. And they're fairly clearly stated. These are not new. They've been around now for more than a decade. And they were published first in 2003, starting from birth, where early initiation is recommended. There is very clear data to show that early initiation in the first hour of life is predictive of successful breastfeeding and a whole range of subsequent downstream outcomes. And obviously, exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months, and then transitioning to having a nutritionally adequate and appropriate complementary feeding through 2 years of age. And some important aspects to these, it's not just, the calories and the nutrient intakes, but keeping in mind the nutrient density. We heard quite a bit about iron, but this applies to several micronutrients that tend to be concentrated in limited sources, and then the safe preparation and storage of complementary foods as well. India has adapted these, and they're not any different, but it's always good when you have nationally relevant guidelines. And this was put out in 2015, which had a wide host of infant feeding experts, not just, the big names, WHO, UNICEF, but also the Ministry of Child Welfare Department and several other stakeholders. And what I would like to point out, and this is really, I think, a product of the work that Dr. Bentley has done, is also emphasizing how mothers should feed. It's easy to say, do this, do this. It's always the mom's responsibility. But providing guidance on how she could accomplish and focusing on feeding styles. And I'll tell you a little bit more what we mean by responsive feeding. So that is actually, India is ahead, has got that in the guidelines. When we want to think about, okay, what are children eating, obviously there are data and having indicators are helpful. As Dr. Neufeld pointed out, when we look at global indicators, they clearly hide disparities, but it's still useful to have benchmarks, because if we do not have benchmarks, then we do not know when we're making either policy or programs or individual level interventions, what are we trying to change? And this was not that long ago, but WHO, UNICEF, various partners and leaders in the field came up with these specific indicators. There are 8 core indicators. Some of these have been around for much longer, but there are 3 related to breastfeeding, clearly relevant to the infant, very young child. The first is what I commented, that early initiation of breastfeeding is really, what proportion of children are kept to the breast within 1 hour. Exclusive breastfeeding under 6 months, and then continued breastfeeding at 1 year. So for the third indicator, if you were to do a survey, whether it's nationally representative or whether it's in your personal, in your hospital practice, if you interviewed mothers of children who are 12 to 15, you could ask them, did they breastfeed through 1 year? And you would get a sense of if this is happening. But equally, and what we really are focusing today is on complementary feeding. Oops, I didn't mean to go. It is a little bit more complex. We've always known, young children have to be fed foods that are adapted to their developmental stage. So, you're starting with soft food, semi-solid, and transition them to what sometimes is known as family food. But the consumption of iron-rich foods, ensuring a minimum dietary diversity, diversity. Someone commented about the rice paste, so that's where the need for ensuring how do you get adequate diet diversity, frequency of feeding, and then the last one actually is a composite of diet diversity and meal frequency. So these are, again, as I said, indicators that help us track what's happening in this area. Unlike adults or even older children where we can do diet recalls and say, okay, do they meet their nutrient needs? With young children, these are really important. So in a sense, they're behavioral, but they're very important on their own. So that's been a real major advance as we think of, how do we assess adequacy of dietary intakes in young children. So these are data which are now being collected. There are the demographic health surveys, other national surveys. Having these indicators has been helpful. It's not too complicated to collect it. They're, on a questionnaire basis. But you can see clearly we still have work to do. I think a lot of progress has been made over the last several decades, but still globally, less than half the newborns are put to the breast within 1 hour of birth. And there is some variation. You can see some parts faring better, but it's pretty comparable. In fact, some of the low-middle income countries are doing even better. When we look at exclusive breastfeeding rates, these have improved over time, but you still see only about 40% who are exclusively breastfeeding up to 6 months of age. I see this as a positive number. I think 20 years ago, 30 years ago, there were parts of the world, the Brazil example was brought, where exclusive breastfeeding rates were much, much lower. So there's work to be done, but I think there's a lot of lessons that have been learned, and I'm not going to focus on that's not in this presentation, but it is a transition, right? When you talk about child food, it's one source that the child reaches. With complementary feeding indicators, I think we have a lot of challenges. One, there isn't complete data. So this is really important. I think we're moving towards it. And based on existing information, we find that only a third of children are getting even just the minimum diet diversity. We're not talking about adequacy of intake. We're not saying how much the child eats. With the minimum the diet diversity, that's really asking mothers if their child received foods from at least 4 different food groups. We're talking about fruits and vegetables, legumes, the different food groups based on nutritional value. And it is still children continue to receive monotonous diets that tend to be primarily cereal-based, and work is needed there. And there is quite a bit of data showing that children who get this the minimum diet diversity have better outcomes, both in terms of micronutrients, but overall it's a good marker of their risk of stunting and future growth and development. There's also, as I said, when you see these global estimates, they mask a lot. So this slide is showing the disparities between poor and rich, even in these low-middle income countries, where people who have limited resources for a variety of reasons are less likely to give their children a diverse diet. And it's pretty consistent, as you see, in different parts of the world. Poverty is an important determinant of, it operates through different ways. It could be poor education, it could be access to foods, a variety of things, but it's important to keep in mind as we are looking at interventions to address this. Excuse me. When we look at Meal frequency, this sort of addresses our ability to meet the nutrient intake. So the other one is, one might think, is a qualitative indicator. We're seeing if the children are even receiving the foods, whereas minimal meal frequency, all of you have ever fed young children know their stomachs are small, they need to be fed frequently, and there's enough evidence to show if you feed them more frequently, they're more likely to meet their nutrient intakes. And you can see these disparities exist between poor and rich across the various regions. And even among the so-called rich in these settings, there's work to be done. So some people commented about culture, taboos, etc. It's not just lack of resources. It is lack of knowledge on what should be provided to young children. A little bit of data. We are here in India, and very fortunate to have had these large national surveys that allow us to track progress. And there have been significant improvements in the last 10 years. When we compare the data from NFHS 4 to NFHS 3, so NFHS 4 are the most recent that were data collected from 2015 to 16, and then NFHS 3 from 2005 to 2006. We don't have all of it, but you can see clearly all the numbers have moved upward. So there's no need to be pessimistic, but the work still needs to continue. So understanding where the greatest gains have been accomplished, how were these accomplished, would be important. And the role of, policy level, economic development, combined with what's been done for promoting optimal child diet, whether it's breastfeeding promotion, complementary feeding, it's a package. The next set of slides, and this was something that was asked by our chair, children don't just eat food, they also consume a lot of their calories through liquids. Obviously, there are the nutritive liquids, and then there are non-nutritive liquids. So we were wanting to look at, what are children drinking? And upon reviewing the literature, there's actually very limited information on beverage consumption. And this is a concern because we have data from some other parts of the world where these trends have changed dramatically, and we shouldn't wait till things get really bad. And this really relates to the non-nutritive beverages that are available in the market, the sugar-sweetened beverages. So Dr. Bentley has used data from a paper, actually in the US, where they analyzed beverage consumption among young children under 5 using a nationally representative survey. That's short form is called FITS. It's Feeding Infants and Toddlers Study. And this gives an idea that even in a so-called developed country, feeding practices don't have to be optimal. These are the recommendations by the American Association of Pediatrics. Some of these are familiar. They're similar to the WHO UNICEF. But they do have a very specific one, that's the last one, that talks about abstaining from sugar-sweetened beverage and limiting the consumption of fruit juices to 4 ounces a day. And this has been a constant challenge. Overweight and obesity rates are extremely high in the US, and there is actually a lot of data clearly showing that a child who is overweight or obese is going to continue in that trajectory and be at increased risk of several non-communicable diseases. So we have to start early, and when they look at the data, we actually find that this is from the US, cow's milk consumption went up, and average consumption of fruit juice was twice that the recommendation. So this is to give you a flavor where, when we go look for the data, unfortunately, I'm not sure, maybe some of you might be aware of data from settings like India And again, I think the myth of urban-rural differences might be changing because many of these products are available in the marketplace across the spectrum. So that's something I think we need to know. And there's actually some interesting data that was done in India where they've looked at beverage consumption, and in settings where access to safe water is limited, they found that among those where water is scarce, sugar-sweetened beverages such as juice or soda are more widely consumed by young children. So that's really a concern. And parents are not stupid. If they perceive that these are safer than the water that they're getting, they want to do what's best for their children. But we know that there are adverse consequences with increased consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages early in life. The next set of slides really move to the core of Dr. Bentley's work. She's a nutritional anthropologist by training, and really the whole idea that it's not just, okay, feed the child's going to meet the nutrient intake. It's not as simple as that in young child feeding. We have to take into account the developmental stage of the child. So that's where we have people who work in the area of child development. We have, obviously, the nutrition experts, where we look at things from what's the adequacy of the diet. And then the anthropology is really getting into understanding the culture, the context, why children are fed in a particular way. And it is really the result of this multidisciplinary work of investigators who have come together that the idea of responsive feeding came. And this is not work, it's decades of work that have been done in Latin America, India, Vietnam, different settings. So what is responsive feeding? There's quite a few papers, and these are just references showing why this is important. And the key thing here is responsive feeding is the ability of the parent or the caregiver, maybe the grandmother, whoever is feeding the child, to be sensitive to the cues provided by the child. So this is, in many ways, child feeding is a transactional model. Children are very much the players as much as the person who's feeding the child. And so responsive feeding really looks into how the caregiver or whoever's feeding the child is able to recognize and respond to the cues. So obviously, this is just showing some pictures. The key thing is, a baby who is 6 months is developmentally very different from a child who's 15 months. And they are discovering things, and how do you integrate feeding into it? And most importantly is even just understanding when the child is hungry. A very young infant, typically, when they cry, the mother said, child is hungry, but not always. There are situations where it's not just about hunger, and so how do you train moms or caregivers or fathers to recognize these? And what's not responsive feeding? Sometimes people say it's easier if you know what it's not supposed to be. And this is kind of, it can go in two extremes. One is what's known as sort of laissez-faire. You let the child dictate the process. You give in to the child. I don't know how many of you have had a child who has a temper tantrum. If you've not, you are a minority. But basically, the child's holding the upper hand, and the mother just wants to be done with it and is going to give in to whatever. That is not responsive feeding. The other part of not being responsive feeding is the opposite, that I think many of us in the South Asian culture are not familiar with. You will eat this, otherwise, if not, there'll be dire consequences. And it's a fine line, but there is actually quite a bit of work showing that when you have, this pressuring to eat, it can work both ways, whether you're dealing with an underweight child who may not, benefit versus also an overweight child, and if you are going to deny them everything and this punishment, then that actually makes them want that food even more. So there's a lot of behavior, psychology that's involved in this. So these are just a few examples of what wouldn't be responsive feeding. So in this context, there are two very nice studies that Dr. Bentley has been involved in that take into account feeding styles and how do they influence, nutritional outcomes, whether we're talking about immediate ones of the actual dietary intakes and, of course, downstream nutritional status. So the first one is actually US-based, but this could be relevant to any setting. This is work that she's done in North Carolina with low-income African-American families. So when you're talking about poor resources, you're talking about disparities, prejudice, a lot of these things are very much there in many of these communities. When they looked at the various risk factors, in addition to what typically is done in nutrition studies, that you look at child growth, you look at infant dietary intakes, they also collected detailed information on infant feeding styles, as well as understanding the environment. So this goes back to that complex cascade slide that Dr. Neufeld showed. Yes, individuals are important are in the center, but they're not acting in isolation. You are in these concentric rings of what is surrounding you, whether it's the family environment, whether it's what's sold down the street, whether it's all the way in terms of what is in that marketplace where people have access to. So people have used this thing of obesogenic environment. It's not just about intake, it's also about activity. So, watching television. Some of you may have heard the word mindless eating. People, when they're distracted, do not know what they're consuming. So the objectives of the study was really to look at these relationships, and they also collected data on infant temperament, because there are differences in that as well. And some key findings, this is analysis that was done by her doctoral student, Megan Slining. They actually collected longitudinal data. It was not just a one-time. They followed these children up, and they were able to sort of get that time sequence. So what the child is exposed to at 6 months or 9 months, and how does that translate to downstream outcomes. And it's very interesting. What they actually found is overweight per se, this is using body mass index, was not associated with motor development. That's what you see on the left-hand side. But subcutaneous fat, so again, where the fat is, increased subcutaneous fat was associated with delayed psychomotor development. So these relationships are nuanced, and it's not just about weight and height. It's also about, and we have Dr. Yagnik, who has done a lot of work on body composition. So understanding, and some of this may be purely what's known as biomechanical. I was at the pediatric ward in Ramchandra Hospital in Chennai a few days ago, and this was sick children, and we were doing child development assessment. And, there was that skinny child, clearly undernourished, but he was running around all over the place. And then there was this other healthier child who was chubby, and the mother was not their grandmother. She's like, child's not able to pull himself up to stand. And it's pretty obvious, the child has more gravity to defy. Now, I'm not saying being malnourished, okay, you're going to be developed, but the point is the timing of these are variable, and your body composition will influence how development progresses. The other piece that they found was the feeding style. This is what, we talked about feeding style, but if some of you, so what? Why not? Pressured feeding has worked. If I don't force my child to eat, that child is not going to, consume the food. And they found, especially as we are in this nutrition transition, children who were getting pressured feeding were more likely to consume more energy, reduced odds of breastfeeding, and high risk of inappropriate feeding. Now, in some settings, those of you dealing with undernourished children will say, oh, that's good, they consumed more. But remember that these feeding styles don't go away, they continue. And as they grow up and they are consuming, their food consumption patterns may predispose them to overweight and obesity. The last set of slides are reflecting the work that Dr. Bentley has done right here in India. This was in collaboration with Dr. Shahnaz Wazir. Some of you may know of her at NIN. This is the National Institute of Nutrition. And really a very fantastic group of experts who have worked globally on child feeding approaches, how do we improve dietary intakes, along with collaborators. And basically, they conducted a randomized controlled trial, not using our pills and potions, as one might say, but rather evaluating a behavioral intervention where they were able to evaluate how intervening on feeding styles could translate into improved nutrition. So this was funded by the National Institute of Health. And basically, this was done in Nalgonda. This is in Andhra Pradesh. And they worked with existing structure, that is the ICDS blocks. And they randomized, they had 60 villages, and they had 3 arms of 200 mother-infant pairs. And basically, the 3 groups was the control, which is business as usual, the ICDS program, whatever inputs were being provided, they did not interfere with it. They didn't do any, the field team just did measurements. Then there was the second group that had an intensified complementary feeding education. So purely education, you could call it, you have the Ford and then the Cadillac and then the Benz, right? So the middle one was just let's look at the curriculum, provide more directed complementary feeding education. The third one is also complementary feeding education, but they had this component of addressing feeding styles, particularly responsive feeding styles, teaching moms how they can recognize cues in the children and addressing that. They had, obviously, the primary intervention was a lot of, what some might think of, we say, BEC material, but appropriate pamphlets, flip charts, training. They used, actually, village-level workers. These were mothers who were identified from the community. There was a real focus on strategies for interpersonal communication. I'll be talking a little bit more about this in my presentation, but much more intensive communication strategies, and the home visits were more frequent, depending on the age of the child and the message that had to be communicated. And so these are just showing you, these were local women from the communities. And the focus of the responsive feeding was that the whole feeding episode was something that was pleasurable. It's not a fight between the mother and the child. We've all been there. I had an underweight child, so I can relate to this. It is not easy. It takes a lot of patience feeding small children, or children who really are not interested in eating, because there are some who like to eat and some who are busy doing other things. And basically, these are some of their findings. These have been published. The references will be there in the updated presentation. But when they just look, we talked about diet diversity. Obviously, rice is universal. Everybody was giving that. But when you started looking at nutrient-rich sources, locally available. These are, rural settings, whether it's meat or poultry, eggs, spinach, even something like just adding a little fat to the diet. All these numbers you can see went up in both the groups, just the complementary feeding education group, as well as in the enhanced group that focused on styles. For some of these, you don't see big differences between group 2 and group 3, but for some, there are upward differences, like the added fat, for example, is higher in the group 3, which had the responsive feeding. And they also were able to look at actual nutrient intakes. They measured it at 9 months and 15 months. In the interest of time, I'm showing you the 15 months, but the 9-month figures are quite similar. And they found that intakes did increase across the different nutrients. However, you can see there are still gaps. I mean, for nutrients like vitamin A and calcium, these children did not meet their requirements. So again, it's really important to understand this is one part of the package. I think keeping in mind the food environment within their existing resources, how much can we move nutrient intakes? I think this gives a reasonable sense of it. But what's really interesting is not just the nutrient intake data, it is the functional outcomes, something that I am very close to in the studies I do. I always say most parents, what do they want? They want their kids to be smart, they want them to succeed, they don't want them to fall sick. And this is where they looked at motor development. They did not find differences in that, but they did find differences in mental development scores. So clearly, the intervention, the interaction is not just allowing more nutrients to get into the child, but it is facilitating the maternal-child interaction and contributing to developmental outcomes. So again, if we didn't look at these, then we may come away with saying, oh, the intervention didn't do much to improve nutrient intakes. I think that's the message I would take away from this. And so that sort of brings me to what do we know about interventions? We kind of know what children are eating. We know what the challenges are, and a lot of work has been done in this area. There was a Lancet series that were done about 5 years ago. I'm sure many of you have seen it, but really taking this comprehensive view. So we're focusing on infants and children, and there are very specific interventions. So this was not from programs, but rather from where's the evidence base, what has been done to show that if you do these interventions, you can improve child mortality, morbidity, growth, etc. But I do want to emphasize this is part of a continuum, and we talked about this, about the role of maternal health before they conceive, during pregnancy, and then when they're taking care of the child. And this is just looking at that same, where they looked at the interventions. And some key things that came out of that was that nutrition education in food-secure populations works. In insecure populations also, there's a role for nutrition education. The question has always been, okay, if we give education, should we provide, food? So there is studies that have been done that they find the education is the key part, but you might have to know what the food insecurity is in that setting. And these are, of course, controlled trials. They're not out in programs, and I think many of you know India was a leader. The ICDS program started in the 70s and recognized the importance for nutrition education, for food supplementation. But the devil's in the details. It's in the implementation. It is the education materials that are used. It's the training. That's how I started my career. So I feel sometimes we're going full circle, but really it's in the implementation mention that there are a lot of gaps and understanding how we can translate what's been shown in controlled studies to real programs is important. And this is just summarizing some more of the key recommendations showing that breastfeeding promotion has positive impacts. There's also evidence that the effectiveness, this is what I'm referring to. So efficacy is when a controlled setting, like the study in Hyderabad, where it's done in a research context, you have a lot of resources, you are doing it under best circumstances, they work. But when you take it and put it into a program, does it work or not? There are gaps, and again, I have tried to update that literature so as we think ahead, how can we move on? And then, of course, there is, many of you as pediatricians probably see the child who has failed through all these systems and is severely acutely malnourished, and what do you do? So there is evidence showing how we can treat that child and help the child regain some of the losses. But I think as a public health person, prevention is always preferable and more cost-effective, both at the national level, but also for individual families. When you think about the healthcare costs that they incur, we really need to focus on prevention. And this slide summarizes some of her thoughts, and talking about that as we look at the landscape, we need research that addresses both sides, the under and the overnutrition. Sometimes you may have heard this as dual burden. The indicators that I shared with you have been very useful to allow us to track progress. So I think that's work that should continue. Breastfeeding and appropriate complementary feeding promotion has to remain a very high priority across the globe, whether you're talking about a country like the US, or you're talking about a country like Bangladesh, or in sub-Saharan Africa. This has to remain. If we think the work is done, it's never done as long as we're going to have young kids and new moms and parents. So that's important. And there are gaps on beverage consumption. I think the last one speaks for itself. It's not just about what the child is fed and when the child is fed, but how the child is fed. Thank you. We can open up for questions.
Can you just tell us?
Thank you, madam.
Sorry, just one moment. How long should we go?
Yeah. Okay.
15? Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, madam, for your lecture. One thing is important. Is there any data to get the incidence of psychosocial deprivation causing malnutrition in a child? That means his child is giving enough of food, but because of some emotional upset, he cannot grow properly. As soon as you change the environment, he grows properly.
Yeah, so
and what is the basic mechanism for growth failure in a psychosocial deprivation? How it is translated to endocrinology of the child?
So there are studies, especially in the US, which have been known as failure to thrive. Children who are growing in environments with severe psychosocial deprivation, or even maternal depression, that translate into poor outcomes for the children. Whether it is mediated through the endocrine axis, or is it just that the child is not fed adequately, it depends on the setting. But that is important, and in fact, the UNICEF framework, when we talked about determinants of child nutrition, we talk about adequate food, we talk about having health, but we talk about caregiving. Psychosocial is a very important part of it. Yes?
Chinese, madam, for detection of the obesity in a child, so weight is not a very good guide, but BMI percentiles are very important. Like 91 to 98 centile is overweight, and above 98 is the obesity. But it differs from race to race, from country to country. So in India, there is no such data regarding the BMI percentile of a child. Then how will you pinpoint the obesity exactly
So
in a community?
Right. So you are right that BMI is better than weight, and we actually use the Z-scores. Again, I'm going to point to Dr. Yagnik, who has done a lot of work to show that for a given BMI, there could be differences in different populations. To my knowledge, there has not been a whole lot of work to change these cutoffs in young children, but I think that's work to be done.
Go ahead, there was a question here at the back, first here and then here. No, sorry, let's let someone else have a chance. There's two questions there, first here and then over here. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Dr. Bennett Sailam from Kerala, Trivandrum. Thanks for the nice presentation. Only one doubt, it's regarding the starting of the cow's milk. What is the ideal age you can start directly? Means the direct cow's milk, from what age? Is it 1 year or is it 2 years? What is the recommended age?
So the AAP says not to introduce it before 1 year of age, if I'm not mistaken. And that's more coming from allergies, etc. So I think in India, we do not have India-specific recommendations. But that's related to the ability to handle the protein load, I would say, after 1 year of age.
Okay, yes, right there, go ahead.
Dr. Krishnan, my question is for the breastfeeding till 2 years of age. You said that the breastfeeding is recommended. How do you maintain a balance? Because children might be wrongly feeding more number of times. Because I have seen children who come to us feeding the whole night and not taking adequate diet during daytime. That's a challenge. Is there any recommendation saying that this is the number of times? Because that is what we are supposed to educate the mother. Can I ask the other questions also, same time? Yeah. The next question would be, how do you manage infants during summer? Because summer is a time when dehydration will be at its peak because infants being small. Is there any specific recommendation regarding the beverage intake and the milk intake? Because you said juices should not be given. So how do you maintain a beverage balance? Because you can't say that this complementary feeding alone should be given. And my last question is, how about non-breastfed infants? Non-breastfed infants who are below the poverty line, who cannot afford formula feeds. Is there any recommendation for cow's milk or the other milk to be given?
So there's a lot of questions on that, and some of it's individual. I'm not aware of any recommendations based on frequency of breastfeeding because it's highly variable. A mother who may say she breastfed the child 5 times, the actual intake may be very different from one mom to another mom. It depends on the other thing. I think once the child turns 6 months, we all know that breastfeeding alone is not adequate. So the focus is not saying do not breastfeed, but the focus is on ensuring the adequacy of the complementary feeding, the quantity, the frequency of feeding, the consistency. So if I were an individual person and a mother is breastfeeding and if the child's not getting adequate, and let's say that child is 18 months, rather than focusing on saying don't breastfeed, I would focus on what she should be feeding the child. And that's kind of where the adequacy of the feeding style comes into perspective. With respect to beverage consumption, the role of heat, this has been studied for a long time. There are some well-done studies, may not be recent, that were actually done in even the really hot climates like in the Middle East, etc., that have shown that breast milk is actually technically waterier, that you can maintain water balance of a young child if he or she is exclusively breastfed. As someone who has breastfed and some others who have, the mother's hydration status is really important. So this is where I think it's really important, especially when we're dealing with breastfeeding, et cetera. Often, as a pediatrician, you're looking at the child, but what are you counseling the mother to do becomes important. So that's to do with it. With the non-breastfed child, we know well that untreated cow's milk can cause a lot of problems. So globally, the recommendation is, you know, if you can even find alternate sources of breast milk, easier said than done, but there's a lot of work that's been shown that those options are feasible if people cannot buy commercially produced formula. Because formula is different from untreated cow's milk.
Yeah. So we have a lot of questions. I'm going to ask
May I just add to that?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah. I think regarding the last question, when breastfeeding is not possible, we have to accept that there are certain cases when breastfeeding is not possible, but there should not be that many. And I think what we have to do, and it's our responsibility as health professionals, to really reinforce education with mother to show how to continue breastfeeding. Each mother has certain periods where, you know, she has difficulties in a breastfeeding, but this is a role of family, of health professionals, of society to help her. So we just should not accept that this should be the norm when child, especially if it's a low economical status, should not get breast milk.
So here and then there. Go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. I just want to pass a question to all of us, like the difference between a paste and a puree in complementary feeding. Most of the mothers make a paste out of the rice and the dal and whatever, and the child finds it difficult to swallow, often vomiting it out. However, puree would be a better option. So I do not know whether this message really goes down to the mothers, when that might help in the complementary feeding of the children.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to take 2 more questions, Usha. Sure. I'm writing them down. So here and then over here.
Good afternoon. Dr. Jitendra Oswal from Bharati Vidyapeeth Medical College, Pune. Hello.
Hi. I can't see the lights.
Yeah. So my question is, last 2 decades, I think many of the Indian couples are opting for only one child, single child. And we have seen various inappropriate nutritional patterns in this single child, and which might lead to obesity and micronutrient deficiencies. So are you looking at this, one of the risk factor as a single child as one of the risk factors for obesity, micronutrient deficiencies?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good afternoon, madam. I'm Dr. Ghosh here from Mumbai. Very practical situation. After 6 months, when we convince the parents not to introduce cow milk, even before 6 months, but immediately the parents or the accompanying grandparents, they start giving example. We had given our sons or daughter cow milks, we didn't face any problem. So what new thing is going to happen to my granddaughter or grandson? So how can we convince them?
So I think I'll be talking about behavior change approaches. When you're dealing with individual
cases. Just to interrupt, I feel maybe out of these 200 people, 50% had consumed cow milks during their infancy.
But a lot of them are stunted. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, I think the education is not just to be focused on the mother. You have to have, again, the layers, and a family focus becomes important. And I'll be talking about some of those approaches that have been used. And I think, unfortunately, as physicians, you're not trained in counseling when you have to counsel the entire family.
I understand that it's very difficult, but at least let's try to make sure that those who are mothers today, tomorrow they will become grandmothers, and they will start to understand how to help to their daughters and daughters-in-law to have a good feeding practices.
Okay. The other 2 questions, Usha, were paste versus puree, and then single child.
Okay. So the single child, I can answer. I have not seen any analysis. I do think the people who have only one child may be a very selected group, and that's certainly something we can look at the data and see. I can hypothesize as a mother of a single child, very late, how this can translate into increased risk for poor eating habits because all the attention is focused. At the same time, we have our neighbor that's had a single child policy for many years, and how This is not unique to India. I think it is a global phenomenon, and definitely, again, it relates to how do you educate mothers before they become mothers on feeding styles and feeding practice.
So I think the
paste versus puree, I think, is a very important one. And again, both paste and puree are English words. So I think what's really important as we develop these messages, we have to be contextual. We have to understand what's happening, the behavior change, interventions that have been successful, go down to the ground and see what's happening. And you need to also get feedback from the mothers on what children accept.
Okay, yeah. There's 2 questions over here.
Yes.
I'm Dr. Sridhar Ganpati from Bombay. This Nalagonda study that you showed us,
yes.
Did you take growth parameters and prior infections and antibiotics that were used on those babies before you came to a conclusion of improvement in cognition? Because there is so much spoken about the microbiota.
Right.
And we deal with malnourished children at Sion, wherein we have found that there are a set of children, even with the best of nutrition, they don't improve. Okay. And we consider them under a category of environmental entropathy.
Right. So I didn't do the study, but I know that it was a randomized trial, and they definitely controlled for several of these factors. So it was, taking that into account. Now they didn't treat that, and it doesn't take it away. So that's something, again, when you're an individual practice, you're doing on an N of 1. But they didn't, for example, get rid of all the stunting, obviously, and you saw even nutrient intakes, they didn't meet the requirement. I hope that helps. Yes?
2 comments, madam. One, there is a clear recommendation from the Indian Academy of Pediatrics about cow's milk not being given below the age of 1 year. So there is a recommendation.
Thank you.
And the second thing is that we are more worried about iron deficiency caused by cow's milk rather than the protein load. There is a very significant difference in iron once the baby is given cow's milk, which is why American Academy of Pediatrics initially said you can give cow's milk with iron supplementation, and it was found to be useless.
Right.
So that's why they shifted to 1 year. The second is about the puree business. There is a very good set of studies which have shown that granularity of feeds given below the age of 9 months increases the diversity of feed which is given later. And if the child is given the granular feeds after 9 months, their diversity significantly decreases. So I think that should be there. My question is now, knowing that what the mother eats, the taste as well as the smell transmits to both the amniotic fluid and the breast milk, and it is known that what the mother eats makes a difference as to how the baby accepts complementary feeding. Was that factored into this study? Because there's no mention of what has happened in the antenatal period.
Right. So thank you for clarifying those guidelines. That was my understanding, but it's good to know it's written somewhere, so we're not contradicting. What the mother feeds, the maternal diet, definitely would influence the acceptability. The intervention that was done in Andhra Pradesh did not intervene on maternal diet. But I think there is an opportunity that you are dealing with that. And I would hypothesize you don't do it. I would suggest in this day and age, given the magnitude of maternal undernutrition, we shouldn't do it after she's delivered the baby. That needs to go into the nutrition education package that starts during pregnancy.
With
Sorry, we have several people that have had their hands up for a while. So first in the back, then I'll come to you, and then to you. But if you could do the 3 questions and then give a response. Yeah. So in the back, and then 1, 2, and then 3. And then I'll come over here.
Good afternoon. Myself Manish from Pune. I want to ask about any data or any research on baby-led weaning and early introduction of solids to the baby or finger food. And as you have told, there is no need of adding sugar or giving sugar to the babies. Is there anything to add, or like adding salt to the diet for like up to 1 year of life? Salt.
Right. So,
sorry, Usha, 2 more questions just so we can get through here.
Yeah, I'm Guvendra. I have come from Shimoga, Central Karnataka. See, my question is continuing what doctor said. See, most of us concentrate on maternal nutrition during pregnancy. But what we find on the contrary is many of the babies whose mothers are in the exclusive breastfeeding phase, some of them are on compulsory bland diet for as long as sometimes up to 3 months to maybe 5 months. It's culturally acceptable. And most horrifying thing is this is not only prevalent in the uneducated low income group, it is even highly prevalent in the highly educated and the rich people as parents. So this, we know that more iron is required for a breastfeeding mother, let alone more iron. They don't even consume the regular basic recommended diet for a healthy adult. So I think the maternal nutrition post-pregnancy is mainly neglected, because obstetricians many times, once delivery is done, their duty is over. And pediatricians mostly look at the babies. And what mother eats is, many people ask, can I eat this? As if it's something horrendous to eat a regular diet during the early phase of post-delivery. So that is one thing I wanted to highlight. Maybe that has a tremendous impact. Not only the quantity, but micronutrient. Third, also as the sir said, taste and texture. Second is whether breastfeeding beyond 2 years, you had a mention in one of your slides. But now most of the studies, as the latest data has come in, many experts say breastfeeding beyond 2 years is actually to be, not advisable. And a point to ponder on that. Okay. And lastly, as you said, responsive feeding, because no one child follows a set principle for feeding. Because in India, for centuries and maybe for decades, for generations, we know that Sama, Dana, Beda, Danda are 4 principles for any problem solving. A mother can apply this depending on circumstances and depending on the scenarios and depending on the setting. So I think responsive feeding should incorporate these 4 aspects, because as we as parents, we know most of the times one approach doesn't work all the times. It's a mixture of these 4 at various stages and various situations.
Hello, yes. I'm Dr. Raju Kafle from Nepal. So actually, I had one query regarding this animal milk. Like we are all the times focusing on talking about cow's milk, and so what about other types of animal milk, other types of organic milk? In Nepal, people talk about buffalo's milk, so the problem of protein allergy, I think it's less in buffalo's milk. So what is the clear explanation that we should not give buffalo's milk as well till 1 year? And I have seen cow's milk is not only the problem, they say it's an organic milk. So why don't we focus on other types of milk, just only cow's milk we talk about? Oh.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, I will take the last question. When we are talking about animal milk, any animal milk doesn't have still enough iron to satisfy baby's needs. And this is the key point why WHO doesn't recommend to introduce cow's milk as a drink for child. It can be introduced in a certain part for the complementary feeding to cooking. So this is the key point. Would it be buffalo milk? Would it be cow's milk? Would it be camel milk? Would it be other animal milk? So it would be the same. I think cow's milk, because it's the most common animal milk which is available in the world, that's why it's used for feeding of baby. And I can give the word to Kim to reply on that.
I just looked up the WHO recommendations on the non-breastfed infants, and from 6 months they say 200 to 400 milliliters of cow's milk. I think the main issue is the protein load. So the amount is very central. So if the alternative is no milk at all, at any kind, I would say that from 6 months, a low amount would be okay. Before 6 months, it's a special issue that I don't think we should discuss here, and I don't know the details of it.
Okay. Did you want to respond to those other?
No, there was a salt and sugar.
Salt and sugar.
So I may not do it in the order. It's more what comes to my mind and what probably I'm more familiar with. So the maternal nutrition, I completely agree that maternal nutrition in the postpartum phase has been completely ignored. And as we think about child feeding, the, just the maternal well-being. The mother who's anemic is not going to do responsive feeding because she herself is not very responsive. So, and unfortunately, the way sort of medical systems work, they don't take the whole household into context. So I think this is something that needs to be integrated, and you continue engaging with women postpartum and having messages. And we're working actually in this space right now in India, where we're looking at what's happening in the first 6 months among women who are breastfeeding, but what's next. So I think that's a gap, and it's an important gap. The question about salt versus sugar, I think these are becoming really important issues with the increased consumption of processed foods in the diet. We know there's plenty of literature to show that, to put it bluntly, these are addictive. If you have more sugar, you like to eat things that are sweeter. If you start eating chips and saltier things, you start upping. So salt intake studies have shown if people reduce the amount of salt, they kind of get adjusted lower and higher. I'm not aware of any specific recommendations about addition of salt to the infant diet. In fact, we were working on this when we were talking about fortified salt. We don't even know how much salt is necessarily added. I think, again, if you think broadly in the construct of child feeding, if you are trying to encourage the mother to get something into the child's mouth, children are very perceptive to taste, and so as long as it's not, junk food, some salt, what's in the family diet. I've not seen recommendations otherwise. Sugar, because of the increased consumption of sugar-sweetened beverage. I mean, why not juice? Because it's very concentrated in sugar, and then that continues with later consequences in weight gain, etc. So I think we're clearer on not having too much added sugar. Salt is, enough to taste.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I will check, but I think WHO recommendation, it's mentioned that there is there should not be added salt and sugar in the food of baby up to 2 years of age. But I will check and tell you tomorrow.
Yeah. Did I miss out any question? Okay. I think those are
There's a lot of questions still, but I'm being told that we need to break because it's lunchtime. So apologies, and thank you very much, Usha, for the great presentation.
Thank you.